Hello. You may be able to hear the soft pitter patter of rain outside my window because I film in front of my bedroom window, but it is what it is, and you know what? I think it adds to the spooky atmosphere of October. So, this is my absolute favorite month, and something about this insert adjective here year made me even more determined to enjoy myself during the month of October. And while I originally had some spooky horror Halloween movie type videos planned, which I still might do, I realized looking at my bookshelf that I do have a number of scary, creepy, spooky tense books that I would like to recommend, but I hadn't previously because I don't really think any of them, except for maybe one, falls into the traditional genre of horror. A lot of them are sci-fi, they're murder mystery, they are certainly scary, to me at least, and fit the overall theme of the season, but I thought I would share them. And if you're someone who isn't into, I guess, my instinct is to say hard horror or high horror after, hard sci-fi or high fantasy genres, I don't know, I think some of these books might appeal to you. So, first we have Skin by Roald Dahl. This is actually a collection of short stories, some of which I'd argue are scarier than others. Some of my favorite stories in this book deal with people who are not confident of their reality, people who make choices that in the moment seem to make sense, but as you read further into the story, you start to get this deep feeling of dread in your chest because you know it is going to end poorly. Roald Dahl is one of my absolute favorite authors, and I mentioned that I have a treasury of his children's books and middle grade books on my bookshelf. So this was something that I got when I was a little older, and seeing an author who I had been so accustomed to reading fantastic, whimsical stories like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the BFG, write these short stories that were such a punch in the gut, it just made me respect him so much more as an author and just have so much more admiration for his skill. Some of my favorite stories in this book are Lamb to Slaughter, which I would argue is one of the best murder mysteries I've read, and also Beware of the Dog. Beware of the Dog is really a story about a man's grasp on reality, what is true and what isn't, and what choices he's going to make when he is in a very precarious situation. So while I wouldn't classify this as a horror book, almost every single story has that sense of dread, builds up that tension, and oh my gosh, The Wish. Okay, if you have ever been a child who played by yourself, The Wish will scare the shit out of you. I love it so much, and the reason I'm being kind of vague is because I don't want to reveal any of the twists. I don't want to reveal any of the things that make it so tense and unsettling. But if you're someone who's looking for a short book, but also short stories, and ones that kind of fit that creepy, uncomfortable mood of October that we love to play with, I would highly recommend Skin. Next we have The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. This was actually an impulse buy that I ended up really, really enjoying. This story hops back and forth in time between 1950 and 2014. And it is a ghost story, but also a murder mystery, but also a coming of age and celebration of the bonds of women, or actually young girls. The main character is a reporter whose sister has been murdered. And while someone had been arrested and convicted, she has never really felt completely settled and comfortable with what happened, especially since her sister's body was found on the grounds of an old abandoned boarding school for girls. So the book goes back and forth chapter by chapter from the present day, 2014, where the main character is trying to understand this new information that's come out about her sister's murder, trying to wrestle with her own instincts and whether or not she is just letting her trauma and grief drive her off the deep end or if there's something there, and a story of four girls who are incredibly different personalities and backgrounds who all end up at this boarding school that is haunted. And the way they protect each other, take care of each other, the way that they survive this place, not just the hauntings, but also, the administration and the teachers who see all of these girls as just problem children. This book was something I flew through. It's an easy read. But at the end, I was surprised at how much it stayed with me. And this is something that I would love to see adapted into a movie. I love stories like the 1997 It and, The Sandlot. I love stories that, despite what's happening in the background, whether it's horror, whether it's coming of age, they're about friendship. And I hate, and unsurprised, but hate how so many of these great friendship stories are focused on men and boys. I mean, when you think about female friendship, the first thing that's going to pop in your mind is probably Mean Girls. When I would argue things like Clueless are really great stories about female friendship as well, but I just feel like we don't get as much of that. And as someone who likes spooky things, hauntings, who likes, because also, I mean, actually, it's like a murder mystery on top of a murder mystery, because it's the woman whose sister is murdered. It's also of the four girls, something happens to one of them, and it's the mystery of what happened to her. And there's also the ghost, the main ghost that does most of the haunting in this boarding school. What happened to her? So it's all of these layers. It's all women. I really, really enjoyed it, and I keep it even though I'm not like aching to reread it, because I kept thinking about the story long after reading it. I would say though, how do I put it? Like, I don't think there's anything incredibly remarkable about the prose. Like, it's for me, it's the plot, it's the characters, it's again, the way she does very expertly build suspense and tension in her stories. I cannot think of any chapter or sentence from this book that I was like, wow, the writing itself is what's put it on a high pedestal. But the story, love this story. So I would definitely recommend that, especially if you're more in the murder mystery vibe. Next, we have probably what is the only, 100% horror scary book in my list. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This is the Treasury, because Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark are actually 3 books. It is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. This is probably the reason why I love horror movies so much, and why I love scary stories so much to begin with. Slight tangent. As I was making this list, I realized that even though horror is my favorite genre of movie, and I'm actually in the process of watching a horror/Halloween movie every day for 40 days, I don't have that many, as I said, pure horror or scary books. And so I was really curious if you wouldn't mind letting me know if you're someone who also is a big movie buff or a big theater buff or TV buff as well as a reader. Do your tastes coalesce? Do they align? Like, are you a high, fantasy sci-fi person when it comes to TV and film and also with books, or is it completely separate? Because I feel like my bookshelf is 50% nonfiction, and yet I can't tell you the last time I watched a documentary. But anyway, this collection is amazing. One of the things I love about it is because it gives you horror stories, scary stories that fit every single genre. Do you like ghost stories? Do you like folk tales? Do you like the kind of funny, scary stories that you tell around a campfire at a sleepover? Are you into body horror? Are you into stories that are based on true stories that, you don't really know what happened, but then you Google and the newspaper article is like, no, this might have happened. Like, this hits every single one of them. And as you can tell, these illustrations, oh my gosh, I believe it's Stephen Gammell. Okay, so sorry, I haven't been telling the authors. These stories are written by Alvin Schwartz. Props to Alvin Schwartz. But Stephen Gammell, though? Stephen Gammell did not have to go that hard, but he did. And there are some of these stories that I would argue, just for me personally, aren't the scariest. But then Gammell's illustrations are haunting. Absolutely haunting, and they enhance the story so well. Like, literally, what the hell is this? Like, I've read this story and I'm still just looking at this photo, just like creeps me out. Gammell was incredible, is incredible. And something else I really enjoy about this book is because so many of these scary stories are or the sources, they're passed down from generation to generation. There's a really cool index in the back where you can find out, notes and sources. We can find out where he got all these stories from. Of course, he rewrote them in his own way, but I love an anthology that also acknowledges and references the source material, because some of these books I've actually gone out and read and found, so they delve more into them. Another thing I love about this book is the reading level. It's very simple. It was originally written, I believe, for I don't want to say children, because again, look at this, ma'am. Probably middle grade in terms of the difficulty of the reading level. But as someone who read this as a kid, who read this again as a teenager, and who read them recently again as an adult, what I love is that while I do still have my favorite stories, the ones that still legitimately scare me, creep me out, and make my skin crawl, or just like, I don't want to be alone right now after reading this, a lot of that has changed, because what scares you as a kid and what scares you as an adult can often vary wildly depending on the experiences that you have. So whether you want to read this by yourself, whether you want to read some of the lighter ones, to your kids, or like let them read them at a sleepover, I really, really love this book. And before you ask, I have not seen the movie adaptation because I'm scared. I am normally that person who's like, look, we all just blocked out the Avatar adaptation, so it is doable, but I love this book so much that maybe I'll watch it this month, but couldn't do it. Next we have, this is kind of cheating, but I'll be specific. Next we have Penny Dreadful, Sensational Tales of Terror. This was a gift. It's a beautiful book, one of these collector's editions, because I got really into the TV show Penny Dreadful, that incorporates a bunch of different fictional characters from classic Penny Dreadful's horror sci-fi books. And so someone got me this as a gift, and I wish I could remember who. This anthology has a lot of different stories in it. It has the werewolf, it has the Pit and the Pendulum, it has Frankenstein, it has Sweeney Todd, but I'm referencing this specifically to talk about Frankenstein because that was the first story I read in this book. Now, I understand how that Frankenstein is considered the first sci-fi novel, and I totally get that. I disagree with people who say that it's purely sci-fi, because I do think that there are some genuinely horrifying aspects to this. Also, when you think about that famous quote from our beloved author, Mary Shelley, about having a nightmare after playing a game where people were trying to come up with more and more scary stories to freak each other out. I mean, how can you say a woman who thought that if she wrote a story about the things that terrified her, that they might terrify other people, how could you not qualify that as a horror book? I mean, again, I've said on this channel before, I'm not very well-versed in genres, but I mean, this is a great anthology overall. I've read not everything, but a lot of stories in this book. But Frankenstein particularly, I think one of the reasons I love it so much is because it is written so deftly that you are constantly going back and forth between your empathy and pity and understanding of the creature of Frankenstein's monster, and also repulsed by him, horrified by him, so angry at him for some of the objectively terrible things that he does. And I think the book goes back and forth so well by showing you things from his perspective, by showing you things in a more kind of like a 3D sense, not 3D, a kind of pulled out omnipotent third person sense. And by the end of the story, I felt so, I don't want to say hollow, but I felt, I'm going to say unsatisfied, but in a good way. When you get to the end of the story, at least for me, it was not a moment where I felt, yes, I'm completely in agreement with the way this ended, and I think everything was justified, nor was I like, oh my gosh, this is horrible, this is terrible, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. It's not an ambiguous ending, but I feel like this novel, one of the reasons it's so smart, is it lets you decide for yourself, more so whose side are you on, not necessarily that, but how you view the notions of free will and nature versus nurture. How responsible are certain individuals for their actions given the circumstances by which they were created. And I do think there's like a larger conversation of, Hunchback of Notre Dame, who is the monster and who is the man, between Victor Frankenstein and his creature. But as someone who likes to read, but has not read a lot of classics, and in school often dismissed all of the classics that were, assigned to be read simply because I felt like, well, just because y'all decided it's a great book doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy it. Frankenstein, absolutely, like Frankenstein, Picture Dorian Gray, like these are absolutely stories that I think they deserve it. They deserve to be classics. One thing I will say though is because I had never read Frankenstein before, the first few chapters, don't be confused. Like when I started reading, I genuinely thought I had like opened to the wrong story because of the way that it starts, but it not even like it picks up and gets better. You will understand the story within the story technique that she is using once you get a little bit further. So next we have a children's book. This is Cinderella Skeleton. Now, this children's book is paperback because this is all that they had in stock. I don't know why, but I have a very, very specific aversion to paperback children's books. I like the hardcover, so I will be giving this away and getting another one. But Cinderella Skeleton is a story of Cinderella as a skeleton. And the entire story is told in verse. And all of the characters have creepy, ghoulish, spooky, gross versions of themselves in this story. As you can see, her dress is made of spider webs and cobwebs. She's a dandelion coming out of her hair. This is the dashing, bony prince. Of all the fairy tales, Cinderella has always been my least favorite. I viewed her as a very passive protagonist. I wasn't a huge fan of the music in the Disney adaptation. However, I went through a phase when I was younger where I got obsessed with different versions of Cinderella. Like Cinderella Skeleton, where everything is haunting and Halloween themed, an Egyptian version of Cinderella, a Bigfoot version of Cinderella, an Islamic version of Cinderella. One of the reasons why I loved reading these books is because since the basic story was the same, and the idea that Cinderella is a good person was central to the story, I learned so much about, I say culture, Bigfoot is not, obviously not real, but like the Irish, the Egyptian, the Islamic, all of these different Cinderella stories helped me learn things about these specific cultures, because once you understand what a certain society or culture deems as good, and once you learn what they deem as beautiful, and I argue again that Cinderella's main qualities that she's good and that she's beautiful, it tells you a lot about that culture as a whole. And I've said this multiple times, but I feel like children's books are such a great jumping off point, no matter what age you are, to get introduced to a subject or a field or historical figure, and then to continue moving forward. It's a little thing, but I am 100% confident that the fact that I read, and I'll find it, I'll try to find it and purchase it because I haven't read it in a while, but that I read an Islamic version of Cinderella that talked about, the Muslim faith and talked about things that made a woman good and generous and holy in a very positive and sweet way. It is a very gentle, nice fairy tale. The fact that I read that as a kid, I am convinced benefited me greatly, because my first experience with, women wearing hijabs, or my first experience hearing Arabic words, wasn't in a post 9/11 nationalistic fervor. I already had this idea of what, an hijabi wearing woman was. Of course, this is a children's book and it is a one character. And I'm not saying that I then understood, all the pillars of Islam because of that. But I don't know, just like introduction at an early age to ideas and people who are different than you, and representation, not just for representation's sake, but with a very specific goal. I think it is so valuable. So that was my Cinderella tangent, but I really love this book. If you have a child who's interested in the more creepy and ghouly and enjoys, beautiful illustrations, as always, y'all know how I feel about illustrations, and likes reading books that are in verse, like, come on, she doesn't lose her shoe. She literally breaks off her foot because she's a skeleton. And then the prince carries the foot around on his bicycle as he goes near and far trying to find his Cinderella bride, who is the ugliest and boniest of them all. I mean, come on. Like, Corpse Bride, who is she? I love the Corpse Bride, but the point is, the blueprint, iconic. And the final book that I want to recommend is actually a nonfiction book that isn't about Halloween or, Spooktober, but it's about death. And that is The History of Death. If there's ever a time to study death and the afterlife, ideas of judgment, different rituals and various cultures around the world, and how they feel about purity and baptism and heaven and hell, it is now. It is this time. This book is, like, I didn't read this book as like a textbook for my college courses. This is a book that was written for, I want to say laypersons, but that's not the term. But this was a book written for the general public. And in addition to all the really fascinating information and overview of the different cultures, again, the artwork, like that's scary. And I think especially for someone like me, whose main studies have been the Abrahamic religions, and then within that, like Judaism and Christianity, it's really, really easy to get caught up in a bubble where you don't even understand or recognize your influences when you are so used to looking at something as universal as death through a very particular lens. So if you have any interest whatsoever in burial customs and funeral rites and just, learning about different cultures throughout the world through the one thing that unifies us all, death, I would highly, highly recommend this book. And the last book I want to talk about, I don't have in person because I actually tried listening to it. I'm trying to get on the audiobook train. However, the person that they had narrating it was a man, which I thought was a very odd choice because it was The Yellow Wallpaper. This is another book that classic, was assigned it in school, wasn't interested, and then later on as an adult I read it and I was like, oh, this book terrifies me specifically because I have a, I don't want to say soft spot. I am particularly sensitive when it comes to stories, books, movies, media, real life, in which you are questioning your own reality. What is real and what is not? Is this mental illness? Is this something supernatural? Is this a combination of both? Is this something completely different? Reference to Skin, is this a matter of political corruption that causes a person to think that they are losing their mind because a bunch of people have conspired to create an alternate reality for their own purposes? So all that being said, Yellow Wallpaper is the story of a woman her husband is a doctor and she's been prescribed extended bed rest. But it's not just resting in bed and she can read and write and talk to people and have visitors. It's no stimulation. And this story was based on a real thing that happened to the author, in which she was prescribed this method that was very popular for women at the time who were hyper and irritable and overexcited, which really was sensory deprivation. And in this story, she is whisked away to the countryside with her husband, who is a doctor. The nanny/governess is taking care of her child, and she is put in this big bed in this upstairs room with peeling yellow wallpaper. And what you're really watching is, again, depending on how you look at it, a woman becoming connected to a supernatural entity in the house, a woman pursuing freedom within her own mind and within her own spirit, or a woman slowly losing her mind and the degradation of her psyche. This story is one of the few stories I've read that, reading the descriptions of how the main character moves and what she sees and how she reacts to her environment, actually freaks me out. And the reason I was so frustrated that the audiobook I listened to was narrated by a man is because this is a woman's story. Not just the fact that the main character is a woman, but that she is a representative, a symbol of so many women who have been controlled and manipulated by men. And it's not just her husband, but also another doctor who prescribes this very strict regimen. So many women who were told not to write, not to read, not to exercise their mind, not to go for walks in the garden, whether or not they were under this, health cure, this rest cure, but just as a form of control. Like, of all the stories to have a man narrate it, especially in the scenes where the woman is alone in this room, the moonlight coming down on the yellow wallpaper, when she starts to see shapes and figures trapped behind it, like these intimate moments inside a woman's mind, narrated by a man. Okay, I'll stop. But I recommend reading this book, because I later on found the book online and I was just like, I recommend reading it. I can totally see an argument being made for listening to it if it had the right narrator, and maybe if it was a type of recording in which there were more theatrical elements. But again, this is a classic that I think absolutely deserves to be a classic. And if you're someone who wants something short and unsettling, The Yellow Wallpaper is for you, because it is a tiny book. So those are my recommendations for spooky, creepy, scary October. We'll see if I come out with any more videos about scary movies and horror movies, because while I really enjoy those, I don't know, I think I've been watching so many really high quality video essays and film critiques on YouTube for so long, I feel like a little like nervous and uncertain of, throwing my hat in the ring and being like, here are my 30-second reviews of 30 movies I watched in 13 minutes or less, or something like that. But if you're interested in such a thing, let me know. That may or may not influence my decision. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of October. I hope you cherish and squeeze all of the life out of this incredible, incredible month, and make your own joy. Because we may not have the Halloween that we deserve, but that does not mean we will not have a Halloween. Happy Spooktober.